Hello and welcome. My name is Ashleigh and I'm delighted to be hosting our very first season of LearnSci Webcasts, a series all about educators helping educators. We've invited university educators to share stories about their own experiences and challenges, along with tips and tricks that you can use in your own teaching. Thank you so much for listening and I hope you enjoy. Hello and welcome to this episode of LearnSci Webcasts. Today we're talking about student engagement in a time of apathy and burnout, and we're joined by Professor Nicky King and Dr. Louise Newnham. Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, I'm Nicky King. I am a Professor of Natural Sciences Education and Associate Pro-Vice Chancellor for Education in the Faculty of Environment, Science and Economy at the University of Exeter. And I teach first year in organic chemistry to our natural sciences students. I've been at Exeter for a very long time and have been teaching both the lectures, the theoretical stuff and practical chemistry for many, many years.
Lovely. Hello, and I'm Louise. I'm a senior lecturer at the School of Life Sciences at the University of Sussex. Teach across all year groups, but I'm mainly concerned with teaching the MSc level modules, and I teach sort of cancer cell biology and genetics.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Welcome, and thank you for joining us. Okay, so today we're talking about student engagement, and it's been a turbulent few years in the higher education sector, bringing about many different changes in universities that students and educators have had to navigate. So not surprisingly, there's some feelings of apathy and burnout that's been seen across student cohorts, and therefore student engagement in their learning is a bit of a hot topic on many educators' minds at the moment. So Nicky and Louise are here today to share their experiences of this challenge. So we're going to jump right in with the first question. What are your experiences of your students' engagement and attitude to learning over the last few years? Nicky, would you like to kick us off?
It's interesting. When we first talked about doing these back in the summer, I thought I'd be saying one thing, and actually right now I think I'm going to be saying something slightly different. So what's really interesting is the way that things are changing and changing year on year, I think. I think what I would describe what we're seeing in students is at times overwhelm rather than perhaps apathy. Certainly burnout is an issue, but if I go back to autumn 2020 when we were all online, and we had teaching first years who were coming from school, their first experience of higher education was really interesting. We had lots of really engaged students who really wanted to learn. And we were trying incredibly hard. We were teaching remotely, teaching like this, and giving them enormous amounts of stuff. We had pre-recorded stuff. We had live sessions. We were giving them extra this, that, and the other, loads of reading. And I think one of the things that we didn't quite do well at that time was the narrative around how to engage with that. And some of the students just found it incredibly overwhelming, huge amounts of stuff, and they did burn out. What we saw last year, I think, was quite problematic engagement. So last year, we went back to in-person teaching at Exeter in the autumn term, and attendance tailed low very, very early. We had all the pre-records, all the stuff from 2020 was there, and it was a sort of, well, you've got this stuff, and then you've got the in-person, and we really struggled with engagement. And talking across the sector, there were lots and lots of people who found the same thing. What then fascinates me is this year, my attendance is probably better in my lectures than it was pre-COVID than 2019. Students are coming. They're still coming. We had a reading week last week, and I was really delighted to have 80% attendance in my first year lecture on Monday morning after the break, which is almost unheard of. And I guess my experience is that every time I think I know what to expect, I find that I don't know what to expect. My fear was that this was going to be a bit like last year. The online resources and everything's still there. But actually, this year, students are right back into valuing the in-person and being there. And I think they've been through a journey, and we've been through a journey of trying to understand and navigate that balance of in-person and online and the narrative around engaging with those things. And so I still don't think we know where we're at, because this year has taken me by surprise in a really good way. And so I think we've got to appreciate that we're still on a learning curve. We're still trying to understand how to use the stuff we learned from the pandemic, not overwhelm our students, not burn them out, frankly, not burn ourselves out, but provide that experience that they clearly want. And clearly now, in person is something that our students are really valuing. And it's not just me. I talk to colleagues across the sciences, in fact, across many disciplines at Exeter, and everybody's reporting much higher levels of attendance, which I find really interesting.
Wow, that is really interesting. Louise, do you see the same at Sussex?
Absolutely, yeah. I'm going to echo a lot of that, really. There was a real problem last year with attendance and having empty lecture theatres and things. It felt really weird. And that's complete through doing nothing differently. For this year, so far, it seems good, really good attendance for the big modules. So like first year, I think there's a real enthusiasm for being back in person and students getting to know each other. But somewhere where I'm starting to see an issue is the smaller modules. So I almost think there's a critical mass with attendance and engagement where if it drops below a certain threshold, students think, I don't want to be the only one coming in if others aren't. And I think maybe they just feel more exposed or visible. Whereas in the big groups, there's always going to be a certain level of attendance. I'm just thinking of some of the MSc cohorts when we've got 15 on the course, where we started off with 15 coming, it's tailing off. And I think some of the provisions we put in place, like the lecture recordings, obviously we'll come on to that a lot, but it does hamper attendance.
I think this year we've been clearer around our narrative and expectations. So last year there was a lot of, you should come, but if you feel you can't, or if you've got a bit of a sniffle, or if you're not sure if you're well, don't stay at home. We've got all of this stuff. You won't, the narrative was you won't miss out if you don't attend, because we don't want you to attend if you're ill. Yes. This year we have been much, much clearer that, you should attend wherever possible, because the in-person brings value in these ways.
Yeah.
And actually students are responding to that. But it's interesting what you say, Louise, about the smaller modules. Yeah.
And I agree. It's always this point of term where burnout starts surfacing. There's lots of assignments piling up. And I hear them say it. They say, I've got to go and deal with this lab report. I'm just going to catch up with the lecture later. And I think, even though we really do hammer the importance of attending in person, I feel like this being able to catch up later is a real double-edged sword of allowing, being inclusive and allowing people flexibility if they're unwell, and that kind of, I can catch up with 10 lectures, at the weekend, and then, whoops, I didn't, and things snowball. And
I think that issue of things piling up is quite a tricky one. So we took, I think, what I would describe as quite a gamble this year. So we had a mitigation policy last year that allowed students to have evidence-free extensions of a week. They could have a certain number. I think they could have 4 during the year. And it was to give students autonomy over managing their workload. And it had a whole load of unintended consequences. I mean, partly for staff in terms of marking stretching on and on forever, but also unintended consequences of students who ended up bunching lots and lots of stuff together and actually not helping themselves, thinking an extension would help, and then finding that actually they then missed lectures because they were doing the piece of work, and then it bunched into the next piece of work, etc. So we took a gamble this year of actually reducing the duration of that extension. So they've only got 72 hours. If it's evidence free, so they can request, they can just say, right, I'm going to put off this hand in for 72 hours, but only 72 hours. This is about trying to support students to make a sensible decision about burnout and workload and spreading their work out, but at the same time protecting them from bunching everything up and just ending up with this huge, great sandwich of stuff at the end of term where they've just put stuff off and put stuff off and put stuff off. And I have to admit, at the moment, we've not heard much from students. We haven't had lots of grumbles that we thought we might get. It'll be interesting, I think, because more work is due in now that we've got past that midpoint, and there's far more deadlines as we move towards the end of term. But it's interesting, by actually reducing the flexibility a little bit, maybe we will help. But, it's almost counterintuitive.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Let's move on to our second question, which we've briefly touched on, but it'd be great to kind of delve in further. So over the last few years, what do you think has changed in terms of student priorities, stresses and anxieties? And what are top on the student stress list, as it were? Louise, do you want to kick us off with this one?
Okay, sure. Yeah, I mean, clearly we're in, a real mental health epidemic for this, generation. I've never seen so many students who are struggling, with their mental health and stress levels. But they're also much better at seeking help, and letting you know there's a problem. So maybe it isn't that they've gone up; they're just more open to let their teachers know about it. And I think, there is a real hangover of the COVID era, and these kids were at college, maybe when the lockdowns all happened, and they're struggling to readjust to normal life. But things have definitely changed in terms of their priorities, where at Sussex we're still doing distance exams, so that's where they conduct their exams remotely and maybe have a 24-hour window to draft their answers. And I've seen that has definitely impacted on the way they learn and the incentive to learn things in the same detail, or being able to focus with a topic. And, I think they get very anxious about the different styles of questions that come up, because we're having to come up with questions that they can't just regurgitate lecture content. They have to think about what they've learned and apply it to solve, a problem. And they are very anxious about that because it's a completely different format to what they're used to. But it's also, what we need to do to keep it a robust tool for assessing, the students. So there's a lot of anxiety around how they're being assessed, but also they've maybe adapted their learning and studying tools because, from what I can see, even last year, marking a third year module, there seemed to be a lot of answers that I know were coming up from Google. It's almost, you think, that's something, I didn't actually teach that. Why do they keep bringing up that particular model? And then you look it up and go, it's because it's the top hit in Google. And you think, perhaps they are thinking, I'll hedge my bets until I see the questions more. It's not as much of an incentive than I've got to get everything in my head to go and sit in that exam hall and be able to write fluently about that topic. Instead, I've got 24 hours to watch the lecture again, look up a few papers, which, isn't maybe great for the long term, really engaging with a topic at the level they need to in third year. So I've got really mixed feelings about the distance exams because I know students like them and don't want to go back. And I know the university doesn't want to go back. So, it's just some observations. It'd be interesting to know how things are at Exeter exams.
We have got the choice as to whether we want in-person or online exams. So for many of the mathematical disciplines, we have gone back to in-person exams: physics, maths, computer science, finance and accounting, things like that. But I think you're right. Again, we need to help students understand the difference between those types of assessment and the different ways in which they might want to prepare for those assessments. Because otherwise they will think, oh, well, I don't need that in-depth revision because I'm not going to have to recall it in the same way. So I think we have to take on some more of that responsibility for preparing students for that assessment. Going back to the mental health thing, I completely agree. I mean, we've got huge numbers of students declaring mental health issues. I think that is positive thing that they are declaring, but it is a huge issue in terms of the support. I do wonder, one other thing around that is that the students who came in, even certainly last year, but also to an extent this year as first years, didn't perhaps have the time, that time you spend, whether it's at sixth form, college, at school, when you've got those increased freedoms and you start to learn a little bit more about, organising things and running your life and being a little bit more of a grown-up. A lot of students didn't have as much of that time to develop, and perhaps spent a lot more time at home with parents, carers who did more of that for them. And suddenly there's this sort of expectation of flicking a switch. When you're at school, you're essentially treated as a child, even if you're 17, 18. And your teachers are chasing you for stuff. And if you don't do things or there's a problem, they'll call your parents, etc. And then suddenly, the moment you start university, you're treated as an adult, and we won't call your parents, and we won't nag you, and we won't chase you. And so, that's a big leap for many students. And I think we need to help students and their parents understand that transition between those sort of two ways of working. But also accept that, some of our students are still, and I don't mean this in an insulting way. They're still quite childlike when they come. I know that when I started university, I was incredibly naive. I was a very young 18-year-old, in terms of maturity. And others are really independent and grown up and able to do those things, but that there's quite a range, whereas we're treating them all as adults in that sort of legal framework. And I think understanding that transition a bit more might help us deal with some of those mental health issues that students are raising. But on the whole, I think it's really positive they're declaring if we have the capacity to support. And I do think the other issue is that the NHS at the moment really struggles with capacity to support those students, and it falls to us, but we're not the NHS, we're not treatment organisations, and it's really, really hard for staff to, really be able to provide the support that some students and their parents expect, because, I'm a chemist. That's my area of expertise. So it's really difficult. And then the other thing in terms of student anxieties is the whole cost of living thing, and particularly students without access to that parental support is something that we're all grappling with. And again, I think it's something where we're almost all sort of running just to stay ahead of the position we're in. What can we do, and how can we support students? And I know lots of universities have done lots of things, but sometimes it's just about having someone to talk to. Again, many of these students won't have had to worry about the money themselves before, and that's always part of starting university. But perhaps this year more than ever, it's a real potential problem point. So yeah, I think we need to be really aware of that. But we need to, I think, as academics, we have to know where the boundary is. We can't solve all those problems ourselves, and we have to be able to reach out to support services to get that help for students.
Absolutely. That point about cost of living, I was going to mention, the amount of students that are having to work huge numbers of hours part-time to support themselves. I'm sure you're the same in Exeter, where the cost of rent, in Brighton is insane. I don't know how any of them afford to do it. And I'm thinking of one of my students at the moment who's really bright, and she works 25 hours a week in a veterinary, as a veterinary nurse, which she loves, but she's just completely overwhelmed when it comes to it. So it's like a worry about, inequality between students and those that don't need to work versus those that do are in a completely different boat, aren't they?
Brilliant. Okay, so let's move on to our third question. So what strategies or resources have you used to address student engagement? Perhaps something has worked particularly well for you, or something that hasn't worked particularly well in an unpredicted way, and why? Would either of you like to kick us off with that one?
So, of course, the LearnSci resources have been a godsend. whatever the year, pre-COVID, they were amazing, but particularly during COVID times and after, when attendance had tailed off, I think the usage of lab sims and the smart worksheets to guide them through calculations has been really invaluable to us. And I think anything that's sort of interactive and online is a real win, for student engagement, because it seems to be inclusive in that it's not just the brightest ones that engage with them. It's for everyone. And I think, the way these tutorials on the lab sims are set up, they're short, they can hold their attention. It's not they've got to sit at the screen for 2 hours. So they've been really useful. Another one is it's kind of similar, but H5P, which I know I've spoken to Ashleigh about before. It's just another tool that you do bespoke sort of learning activities to suit your lecture or seminar, where students can drag the labels onto a figure from a research paper. And there's been some good feedback that it's helped those that maybe wouldn't engage with a research paper at that level understand the mechanics of what is shown in that. It breaks it down for them and makes it much more inviting than just putting 10 research papers on your reading list. But in terms of engagement with things like seminar discussions, obviously with the dip in attendance we had last year, sort of post-COVID, when we're coming back to in-person, a really good way I found where you get more views captured is things like Padlet, where you've got an online notice board where they can text in their thoughts and discussions. And I really like that because you capture the views from everyone, not just those that feel confident enough to speak up in seminars, which, as we know, is always the same handful of students. So, these kind of technologies are really valuable parts of our teaching toolkit for this generation.
Yeah, I think Louise has highlighted some really good things there. The other thing I'd say, it's not really a resource, but I think we shouldn't be afraid to bring our whole selves to the classroom. If I go for the ultra professional, slightly dare I say robotic approach to teaching, where I turn up, I deliver this, highly polished but somewhat emotionless lecture, frankly, they're just as well off watching the recording or watching the pre-record of it. I think what particularly, again, the first year's value is, I bring all of my messy self to the lecture theatre, and not worrying about that, and also showing the students that even if things are slightly complex for them, or they're not quite there, they're not feeling like they're fully focused, have still come. It's okay, because we're human, and what you're getting in that session is you're getting me. You're not just getting my material. You can get my material from elsewhere. It's pre-recorded. The pre-records from COVID are me without all the wobbly bits, but actually with the wobbly bits is part of the reason you come, because me stumbling over something and then having to rephrase it in a different way probably helps, because actually you might be having that same stumble. You might be thinking about it that way. And actually, it's not being less professional, but being a bit less polished and just saying, I'm a human being just like you are. The stuff that goes right, the stuff that doesn't go quite so right, but you're coming to the lecture or whatever it is, because you get to interact with a human on a human level, not just getting my material. And I think that's quite important. And again, particularly for welcoming the first years in, I remember turning up as a first year and it being all just sort of slightly robotic men in those days, just delivering lectures at me. Some of them were great, but actually, it's the human touch that I think there's got to be value for coming and attending above and beyond the content that you can access in all sorts of different ways. And some of that value is getting to know me on a personal level, so that when you get stuck or when you have a crisis or whatever it is, actually you feel you can come and talk to me. And when you don't know how to revise for the exam or whatever it is, I'm here as a person you can speak to, and that's some of the value you get from that in-person engagement. So I think that is really important, and I do think we need to do more of that, to bring all of ourselves, because what they get from the in-person engagement is me, not just the content of my lectures.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I wholeheartedly agree that, a bit of empathy goes a long way in, our higher education teaching. And yeah, I think we've got to stop this kind of them and us, the gulf between, how, they're not engaging because, they're lazy or anything, and just going, actually, I'm struggling too, it's week 8. I'm up to my eyeballs in marketing. I'm feeling overwhelmed. I'm there with you, so if I really think meeting them on their level and saying it's okay, if you're struggling, this stuff is hard. I find it hard. I think just helps, empowers them, doesn't feel, it changes their mindset and the way they talk to themselves about, a topic or their learning. So I think, I absolutely agree. We need to bring our whole selves into our teaching and not, try and give this facade that we're all knowing, and if they're struggling to keep up, it's because they're not, good enough in some way. It's not that at all.
Yeah, I do. An element of that is also there's been some really quite challenging narrative in the press around higher education, around what universities are providing and what we're for, and perhaps presented by people whose experience of university is not in the same age as what we're trying to deliver. And actually that must, putting myself in the shoes of the students coming in and hearing that criticism of where I'm about to go. I've chosen university, I'm really keen, I want to go there, I want to do all these things. And university is supposed to be this wonderful experience that will change my life, and it is. And yet I read in the press or I see on the news that, universities aren't doing this, or they're not doing that, or they're doing this in the wrong way. That again, not to break down that image of that ivory tower institution, so that it's part of, come and join our community and learn with us, and make it a much more welcoming environment and much easier for students to get involved in from the word go.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much to both of you. I think we'll wrap it up there. Nicky and Louise, thank you so much for joining us and providing hugely valuable insights. It's been really, really great.
Thank you for having us. It's been lovely.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Lovely chat.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, so thank you all for listening. We'll see you in the next episode. In the meantime, we'd love to hear your thoughts, so please do tweet us at LearnSci HQ with any comments on today's episode or anything you'd like to hear from us in the future. Thank you very much. Bye.